You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Hello. We are talking about self-sabotage today, which I realized I have not talked about self-sabotage on the podcast in a very long time, but it is something that's come up recently in my clinical work, and it's come up often enough lately that I decided I needed to sit down and think about it more and conceptualize the concept while I was, working on clinical conceptualization for my clients. And of course, during this process of me just reflecting on this experience, I decided to bring tarot into the mix. So we are going to talk about lots of different cards today. But first, just to kind of give a recap of self-sabotage, I think most of us view this experience as just getting in our own way. Usually we see people talk about self-sabotage when we are procrastinating, whether that's procrastinating on chores or work or just a task that we know will make our lives better. We might also refer to staying in unhealthy relationships as self-sabotage. I recently just posted a whole episode about that topic. And also just putting off not even just important tasks, but also either important conversations or difficult conversations, or maybe things like overspending, or, when things might start going well, we just kind of dip and we're like, okay, see you, I'm out of here. Or maybe when things just start to get a little bit difficult, same thing. Bye, I'm gone. But basically, self-sabotage is, that experience where usually we know what we want, yet for some reason we are behaving in ways that just ignore our actual goals. Something that's interesting is the deeper we go into the psychological literature about self-sabotage, the more we start to see that this term, this concept, actually describes many different behaviors, but they all produce the same exact outcome. We are moving away from the life or the experience that we consciously say we want. From a clinical therapeutic perspective, doing clinical work, we often assume that most behaviors are functional in some way. So, though that doesn't mean that every behavior is healthy or effective, but what I mean is that every behavior usually serves some sort of purpose. So in the case of self-sabotage, we usually ask ourselves this question of, why do I keep getting in my own way? Why do I keep doing this to myself? What's wrong with me? But as I was sitting with this idea a little bit more and conceptualizing, I realized a better question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what is this behavior trying to accomplish? So because I was sitting with this idea, I found myself, of course, gravitating towards my cards to help kind of jumpstart my reflection process, mainly because I was feeling a little all over the place, honestly, with my thoughts on this topic. And I appreciate the way that tarot can help me narrow my focus sometimes. And what's interesting is I pulled two cards just to kind of help jumpstart the process. And I pulled the Page of Pentacles and the Hanged Man. And this pairing was kind of disappointing because I'm like, oh, well, okay, yeah, I get it. That's kind of what I'm thinking already. Because with the Page of Pentacles, I'm like, okay, here's this new opportunity, this new idea, the curiosity and excitement around, doing something new. And then the hanged man is suspended in place. There's this pause, there's this inability or even unwillingness, this purposeful pause and decision to not move forward. In fact, to hang ourselves upside down and stay exactly where we are. And so I'm looking at these two cards and kind of annoyed because for me and my brain in that moment, they felt a little too literal because it was the Page of Pentacles was representing opportunity, and then the Hanged Man was representing hesitation. The Page of Pentacles was representing potential, and then the Hanged Man was representing our paralysis. And I felt like they described what self-sabotage is and looks like, but it didn't take me any deeper. And that was frustrating. And I honestly I didn't want to just pull another card. So instead of, going to the cards and asking it to, take me deeper into the realm of self-sabotage, I decided to go through my deck card by card and select cards that reminded me of self-sabotage. I was really trying not to judge my decisions. I made two piles. Like, yes, this feels like I need to talk about this card in relation to a self-sabotage. And then the other pile was, nope, I'm not interested, or it doesn't spark anything for me. And the process was fun and interesting because, of course, like the majority of the cards I ended up choosing to represent self-sabotage felt like a nod to destruction in some way, or just like maybe overall felt appropriate to choose for the topic. However, the interesting part was I kept finding myself drawn to one very specific card. And I also found myself judging my choice to put this card in the self-sabotage pile because it's not a card that I think any of us would traditionally put in a self-sabotage category. And so I was not doing a great job following my own instructions to not judge my own decisions. So I just kind of like set it aside, like above the two piles. And then I kept going through the piles and I just kept looking at this card saying, what is going on with me right now? Like, why can I not choose a pile for this card? And it wasn't that I couldn't choose a pile, I came to realize. It was that I really wanted to put it in the pile of self-sabotage, but there was this part of me that's like, no, of course that card doesn't belong there. What the hell are you doing? And so I'll tell you the card. It's the World. And so I'm looking at this card and I'm eventually realizing it belongs in the self-sabotage pile because it feels like it represents protection. You've got all of these kind of outside opportunities and experiences or influences, but you're inside this barrier. And that's when I was like, oh, this is the direction I need to go in as I explore self-sabotage, because this is where an important shift takes place and where that question that I asked earlier, what is this behavior trying to accomplish, really comes into play. Because at its core, self-sabotage is really about self-protection. And that idea is very well supported in much of the literature that exists on this topic, even if the theories that are explored describe it in maybe a slightly different way. So this realization kind of sent me down, I was going to say spiral, but that sounds kind of negative, but it was really fun because then my brain started going and I'm like writing down all these ideas of directions that I can go with, certain cases in my practice. And I've been deep in some psychodynamic theory lately and being reminded about Freud's work, specifically regarding how, or he believed rather, that we as humans were influenced by two kind of opposing psychological forces. There was Eros, the life instinct, and Thanatos, the death instinct. And Eros was what moves us It's this like instinctual drive that moves us towards wanting to connect or create and survive, really. And then thanatos is the death instinct. So it's this drive or instinct towards just destruction. You could think of this as like the tower. And as we've moved forward and modernized our psychological theories, of course, a lot of what Freud argued has been debated. However, there was something important in his work that we still very much hold on to today in modern psychology. And that's this idea that we often repeat painful experiences, even when those experiences are working against our own well-being, our own best interests, our own desires and wishes. And then post Freud, some of the psychoanalytic thinking shifted a little bit towards, maybe not necessarily why we have this death drive, but more so, why are we staying attached to or loyal to some of these unhelpful, painful patterns? And then we moved into kind of an attachment theory world eventually, where attachment therapists believed that it was our early relationships, especially caregiver relationships, that taught us what to expect from the world, from people, from love, from safety and connection. So if, for example, we grew up and chaos or criticism or inconsistency was really common in our childhood, those experiences or patterns of behavior in relationship dynamics become familiar, and what we believe to be something that we should look for in future relationships. And as adults, we may not consciously be seeking that, but we gravitate towards it anyway because it feels familiar. And I talked about this concept in my previous episode about why we're kind of drawn to relationships that don't actually replenish us or are reciprocal. But then if we look at self-sabotage through an even more modern psychological lens, we could look at it through behavior theories. And if we look at it through that lens, that kind of tells us that, well, self-sabotage works. There's a purpose here because it meets some sort of need, at least in the short term. And this is probably, even though I'm not necessarily a behavior therapist, I do tend to really appreciate this theory and perspective on self-sabotage because, for example, procrastination is probably the easiest human behavior to use as an example here as self-sabotage. Procrastination, in this case, through a behavioral lens, helps reduce anxiety. Same with avoidance. If we are feeling anxious about having a new experience, if we just avoid the new experience or we flake out at the last minute, we cancel plans or we decide not to go, we decide not to accept the invitation, whatever it is, we are remedying that discomfort. So there's that short-term, immediate resolution. And now suddenly we feel okay. But the problem persists because all of these kind of behavioral strategies of self-sabotage, because that's what they are, then create problems later on. And these problems later on could be like, wow, I really missed out on strengthening relationships or having these life experiences. Or they provide enough immediate relief that we condition ourselves, and now our brains have learned to repeat this behavior. Another lens through which we can explore self-sabotage is through schemas. And I don't know if I've talked about schema therapy much on the podcast. I'm going to have to go back and look. If not, that'll be a future episode. But the theories behind schema therapy add another fascinating layer to self-sabotage by exploring the beliefs that we develop or that we hold about ourselves, the world, the people around us, our relationships, because many of these beliefs are formed way before we can even kind of acknowledge them or question them. So, early childhood usually. And they may sound like, well, I'm not good enough, or people always leave. I don't deserve good things. I'm not good enough. Those types of core beliefs. And once those beliefs become pretty well established, we behave in a way that confirms them, even if we are not trying to intentionally do that. And we see this, for example, if someone's kind of core belief is, I'm unlovable, they may repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners, people who cannot love them the way that they need to be loved. Another non-relationship example of this is someone who believes that they're not smart or not good enough or undeserving, or who believes that they will fail at everything, may avoid or procrastinate the task at hand until a failure becomes inevitable. So we can start to see that this also is mimicking a self-fulfilling prophecy type of vibe, so the behavior actually begins to validate the belief that actually created the behavior to begin with. I'm like picturing this, this cycle, this loop, this diagram in my brain. But going back to the card that kind of shifted this view of self-sabotage, the world reminds us that the kind of common thread across all of these ways of looking at self-sabotage is that we are all trying to protect ourselves in some way, whether it's protecting ourselves from shame, protecting ourselves from rejection or uncertainty, vulnerability, a failure, all the things that that are so common that we tend to want to avoid. So now that I feel like I've processed self-sabotage, I want to jump into all of these cards that I felt like represented self-sabotage in some way, or that I at least felt drawn to. Because after I sat with them for a while, the initial reason why I chose them also started to shift as I allowed the world card and the meaning of the world as it relates to self-sabotage and this concept of protection to influence those other cards. So I feel like it makes sense to first start with the world, because that is what has influenced all of this and inspired this discussion and the specific lens through which I am discussing this. So again, quick recap reminder, the world was kind of calling out to me and I was resisting it because it didn't quite make sense to me at first. But then I realized, this figure inside this wreath had a lovely boundary around them, and it felt like a protective circle separating them from all of these outside influences. And I looked at this as both an adaptive form of protection and a maladaptive form of protection. And I think even exploring it through adaptive versus maladaptive here is important as well, needing to discern, okay, in what ways are the decisions that I'm making and the behaviors I'm engaging in actually beneficial to me, and in what ways are they masquerading as adaptive protection, but really they're maladaptive. Another card I chose was the Four of Pentacles. And, this card traditionally is associated with holding on to our resources too tightly. And, we often think of it as, being too protective, being too possessive. But I do think it can also represent our tendency to cling to some level of familiarity, whether that's familiar relationships or identities, or ways of living. This is a pentacle card. And then with the Five of Pentacles, I think about exclusion, but not in the way that we typically think of exclusion with the Five of Pentacles. Because in this case, I'm thinking about how, we might remain outside because we have already decided that we won't be welcome inside. And how often we create an experience of rejection for ourselves before anyone has actually rejected us. It reminds me, gosh, I heard this so long ago, and I don't know, I'm sure it came from some sort of psychological literature, but I think it was a supervisor who shared this. And it was how when we come up with these stories that are either irrational or rooted in anxiety, but haven't actually happened yet, when we ruminate on those, if they do actually end up happening, then we have suffered twice. And I think about that, at least in relation to the Five of Pentacles in this card, or at least in this way of self-sabotage. Because if we are worried or have decided that we will be rejected, then if we do get rejected, well, now we've suffered twice. But we don't actually know if that's the case, but we're denying ourselves the opportunity to see if maybe it's not. I also grabbed the Devil. I feel like that was pretty relevant. I think anyone who's exploring self-sabotage would pull that card. And of course, we all say the stereotypical, oh, the chains are loose, you can remove them. However, I want to look at this more as a thought experience and staying attached again to those beliefs and behaviors and identities because they are familiar. And this reminds me of a quote, another quote, how we will often choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. I also grabbed the 7 and 8 of Cups. And these were actually the easiest cards for me to grab, which after looking and sitting with them for a while felt interesting to me. I mean, I just immediately grabbed those. I was like, oh yeah, that's in the keep pile for sure. But I think the 7 of Cups really stuck out because it's a reminder that every opportunity or experience contains some level of uncertainty, and that every choice that we make requires that we let go of uh, countless other options that also exist. And then the 8 of Cups is asking us to leave behind something in search of something else, potentially something more meaningful, something more fulfilling. We're not sure yet. And sometimes we sabotage ourselves because staying with what we already know, what, is already familiar and certain, feels so much safer than making a different decision or walking towards something that's unknown, even though we know we're walking towards what we actually desire. And then I chose what felt like all the swords, but it was really the 7, 8, 9, and 10 of swords. And this felt like a natural progression of just an increasing internalized psychological pain that exists within this experience of self-sabotage. And honestly, I feel like I'm looking at the 7 of Swords in a completely new way now, which I feel like has been happening a lot with me lately with the 7 of Swords. I'm like, every time I pull this card or I choose to work with it, I'm coming up with a new way to experience it. And now that I'm exploring it through the lens of self-sabotage, this feels like the ultimate experience of self-sabotage because it could be avoidance or some sort of survival strategy that we have picked up, along the way and have refused to set aside. And then the 8 of Swords is interesting because I tend to take a different approach to this card. I know traditionally a lot of folks say, oh, what are you doing? You have all these swords around you. Just take the blindfold off, cut the binding around you. But I do think that this is a delicate card and we are very quick to dismiss what's actually happening in this card. because I do think it would have been very difficult for this person to bind and blindfold themselves. And so it's a pretty layered card because sure, like they could, kind of scuffle away. But, the reality here through the lens of self-sabotage is I think that we have a choice that we have to make. Are we going to stay in this kind of this sphere, this place of beliefs that maybe we've gained over time? Are we going to stay there, or are we going to choose to maybe explore what else might be possible, what else might be true? So in this case, I at least want to acknowledge that, hey, yeah, there were some outside influences and some other things that certainly got this person to where they are. But I also don't want to eliminate all of their autonomy either. And then, of course, the Nine of Swords is, the anxiety card. It's what happens when we get stuck in these beliefs, especially if we choose not to move forward and stay stuck in the Eight of Swords. And we just have this relentless internal dialogue that's making us feel terrible and fearful. And then we end this arc or this progression with the Ten of Swords, which, is this painful ending. And it's what happens if we, choose not to address our behaviors and address our schemas and address the emotions and the thought patterns. And it's what happens when we have this kind of all or nothing thinking of, I'll never recover. This is over. This will always happen to me. This is always how it will end. I also chose the Tower. I think that was also a given. However, I'm not looking at the Tower specifically as self-sabotage itself, but more so what happens when these protective strategies that we've held on to for so long can no longer sustain themselves and can no longer keep, quote unquote, protecting us or sabotaging us. Eventually, everything collapses. Nothing lasts forever. And I think that the Tower brings in an important discussion of, okay, well, what happens when this strategy is no longer relevant or no longer works? And then finally, the one lonesome wand card that I decided to grab, and that's the Ten of Wands. And traditionally, we read this card as the burden card, being overwhelmed, taking on too much. And I'm thinking about, okay, well, why is this person taking on all of this? Why is this person burdened? What was the reasoning behind why they chose to carry all of these wands? And I think this goes back to, again, the narratives that we construct, because a lot of us learn that, okay, well, if I carry everything by myself, then there's no opportunity to be disappointed. No one can let me down because there's no one doing it except me. And I need to anticipate every single problem or obstacle or issue so that I don't get caught off guard. And I don't trust anybody else to be able to do it as well as I do it. So I'm going to overfunction, overplan, overdo, overachieve, overcarry in order to prevent any sort of disappointment or abandonment from anybody else. I thought it was fitting that the Ten of Wands was the last card I ended up choosing, because it tells us that eventually the thing that was supposed to protect us becomes the thing that burdens us. So we really need to start asking ourselves, what is this behavior actually trying to accomplish? Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.